Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. My name is Rabbi Hilly Haber. I work at Central Synagogue. It's an honor to be here and a very special honor to be sharing this table with three incredibly inspiring individuals. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your connection with the criminal justice system, and the work you're doing now.
So it's afternoon now. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dyjuan Tatro, and I am an alumnus in the Government Affairs Officer at the Bard Prison Initiative. The Bard Prison Initiative is a public prison program ran by Bard College, and we have 350 students across 6 different New York State correctional facilities working both on AA and BA degrees. I got into Bard College at Eastern Correctional Facility in 2013. I spent the next 5 years working on my BA degree. I graduated from Bard last year. I'm a math major. Bard does this funny thing, or kind of rather hard thing, where they require all their students to write a senior thesis in order to graduate. I wrote my senior thesis on applied mathematics and biology, more specifically modeling cancer cell proliferation. So I like to point that out because it hints at the transformative power of education in prison. I'm from Old New York, grew up in a single-family household. My mother's disabled, my dad, drug addicted, Vietnam veteran, ended up in prison at a very young age for a long period of time. Got into college and it changed my life. So I think that's enough for now, and then we'll come back and dig some more into that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. How's everyone doing? Good. I'm a little tired from last night, so you see my hair is down to bring my cards, but I'm here to give you the information. My name is Perez. I'm the Director of U.S. Prison Programs for the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. It's a long name, so we call it NERCAT. For sure, we're based out of D.C. I'm the only person that works from home in my sweatpants from Jersey City. So in my role there, I work with faith leaders, sort of like many of you in the room. So I build the capacity of faith leaders and those like myself who have experienced solitary confinement, and I basically build the capacity. So what does that mean? It looks different ways in different states. You know, in some states it just means basic education. In other states it may mean exactly actually resourcing them and plugging them into existing campaigns in their state. Right now I'm directly involved with 14 different campaigns that end solitary across 14 different states, including New York. How I came into the work, well, before that, there's some other roles that are very relevant to this conversation. I also sit on the steering committee of the Unlock the Box campaign, which is basically a group of folks, a group of organizations who are basically re-granting funds. And the idea there is that the funders are usually so far away from the people on the ground actually doing the work that we basically say, hey, give us the money, we identify these folks and resource these folks. Coalitions and grassroots movements are the way that a lot of movements have started. If you look at any type of movement over the last 100 years, they've started and led by those like us, like myself and others who've been impacted on the issues. I also sit on the Safe Alternatives to Segregation Initiative Advisory Council, which is another long acronym for the Vera Institute of Justice, where we're actually working with correctional leaders, advocates, both local and from afar. We've got some folks from Sweden, there in Norway, who also sit on that committee and advising Vera on a lot of their work. And then lastly, very recently was JCPA is also a member of the Multi-Faith Movement to End Mass Incarceration. And the folks who put that together, the Temple, Auburn Seminary, Ebenezer Church, basically the faith community came together and said, hey, we have a moral imperative and we also have a moral obligation per se to kind of hold our legislators accountable to the values that they say they stand for when they first run. So in that capacity, really working with faith communities actually across the country to mobilize them around a number of different issues, including education, solitary confinement, and other conditions. And then lastly, locally, also do some work with the New York City Bar Association's Correctional Education Committee. I'm one of only a few people there that has a felony, is not a lawyer. and who actually does this work directly. And through that work, we're basically just looking at a lot of reentry issues here locally to New York, including solitary confinement, including closing records outlets, and a lot of the state conversations that you have already had. How I came into the conversation was through my arresting officer. At 21 years old, I was arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison. I did 13 out of that, 3 years in solitary. Just like my colleague, I also discovered the transformative power of education. So I'll leave it there. I'm super busy, as you can tell, but I'm glad to be here all week.
Glad to have you. Yeah. I am Professor Kimora, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm so thrilled that Emily, who's in the back, Emily Sachs invited me to be here. So I'm a Jewish woman who, as I mentioned, is a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I've been teaching there for 17 years. And how did I get involved in the criminal justice system? I got involved as an educator. At the time, I was also teaching at the University of Minnesota when I was finishing my PhD in education. I believe in empowerment. And came by accident, one of my colleagues one night came to me and said, how would you like to go work in a maximum security prison and teach people human relations? And I said, yeah. And he said, don't you want to think about that? And I said, no. And, you know, it's not like you sit in class when you're a kid and you say, when they say, what do you want to do when you grow up? You know, I want to teach in prisons. They would look at you funny, but that's what I wanted to do, and I don't know where that came from. But the reality is that I have given you a document which we'll go over as we progress. But the reality is that I believe in education, and that's why I do this work. So I formed the Correctional Education Academy at John Jay College to accomplish two goals, which ties in with what these gentlemen are talking about. One is to advance more research in correctional education. There is not enough of it in this world. And secondly, to promote correctional education as a profession for students at John Jay and throughout CUNY, because I also work throughout CUNY. And very briefly, I will just say, so that we're on the same page, that correctional education is a field that is overlooked, and what it involves is teaching people who could become professionals to teach people in prison and out of prison cognitive skills, which includes anger management, coping skills, social skills, critical thinking skills, all of those items and more. And I love doing it. We'll get to it in more detail in a minute, but that's my introduction. So thank you for having us.
Thank you. So our panel, the topic of our panel is conditions of confinement. Former Governor of California, Jerry Brown, said recently on the podcast Ear Hustle that the system of incarceration in our country thrives under or behind a veil of secrecy. That so much goes on that is just unknown and unregulated. So I would ask all of you kind of to bear witness to that and to lift that veil for us right now. And just tell us what's behind that veil.
I think ultimately what's behind that veil are people. There are people there. Most people's relationship to crime and criminality in this society is theoretical. They see it on TV, they read it on the news, they have stigmatized ideas of who those people are, caricatures of who they are. They don't know those people, so they turn away. They don't try to penetrate that veil. You know, I did 12 years in prison. Johnny spent a long time in prison. We are the people that are behind that veil. But you would sit here and experience me today, and that runs up against that theoretical version of who the person is in prison. And the reason that that veil is there and that we dehumanize people in prison is because we don't want people like you thinking about those people as people and what's happening there and holding people accountable, right? So what's behind that veil in prison are people.
Yeah, and I'm gonna add, you know, because for a long time I used to, like, I came home, you know, as you can imagine, probably a little bit angry, but also just like trying to, you know, find my footing in the world. You know, for a lot of time, I felt a lot of resentment against correctional officers who work inside of these systems. And throughout the years, I learned that the system is so insidious that it not only impacts folks like ourselves, but it also impacts people that work there. right? And this year, there's going to be 3 studies that are going to come out that actually want to show that specifically the solitary condition that impacts correctional officers to a large degree more than other professions, right? Higher incidence of divorce rates, alcoholism. Some of the stuff I already knew just because I remember seeing broken Hennessy bottles in CO's parking lots. You know, and I've seen things throughout the years that let me know that it also impacts folks who work there. I remember this one correctional officer, Officer Stevens, when I was in solitary, you know, and he said, "You are the first," well, he's never met a person of color outside of a correctional context, right? So think about that, because first of all, where are you getting your information from? Hopefully it's not the media, because the media doesn't accurately represent me ever, you know, but more importantly, you know, this explains a whole lot about your disposition and the idea that I need to be punished on top of the fact that I'm already in prison. So there's a few things I want people to walk away with here today. And one thing is to understand that when we're talking about conditions, that prison in itself is the punishment. 12, 13, 20 years not being able to hug your daughter, look in a mirror. You know, there's no mirrors in prison. Imagine not being able to look at yourself. So when we talk about these folks, it's not only just the folks that are there and the most impacted like ourselves, but it's so considered that it also impacts the folks that are working there. You know, and that is serious, because when we're talking about human relations and closing the proximity and bringing folks closer, you know, the only context that you have in reference of me has been fed by the media, then that's going to be difficult for us. You know, the last thing that I want to say about what's actually behind is potential. You know, untapped potential, and I say that because they're some of the most creative, innovative folks that I have ever met in my life. You know, I'm talking about being locked in a pressurized room and I'll get you a magazine from point A to point B. Ask me how. Just give you a sheet and a toothpaste. I'll get it to you, right? But what happens if we can take this potential, harness this potential, and redirect it in another way, in a different way? You know, and to be really real with you, a lot of the organizing work that I do now, I learned in the streets breaking the law. You know, and you know, I've managed to find a way to transfer those skills in a sense. So it's easy to like look at us and go, "Oh wow, they're great." You know, damn, Johnny, solitary is so bad. Well, look at you. You know, so don't idolize us, and not that you are, but don't look at us and say like, "Wow, this is like they're great." We're only examples of what happens when folks can be given opportunity, or when folks see more in us than we sometimes see in ourselves. So yeah.
I think, if I may,
Please,
I'd just like to
please.
Add on to that last point that he made. I'd like to say that, you know, I'm not an exceptional person. I was given an exceptional opportunity, and that was an educational opportunity in college, and you know, that dramatically altered the trajectory of my life. And if greater people had that opportunity, we would see lower recidivism rates. We would see more productive communities, more stable communities, more loving and holistic family structures. And so again, you know, behind that veil are people, and you know, their brothers, their fathers, their mothers, their grandfathers, they are uncles, they have lives, and we can't just reduce them down to the crime they've committed. We can't decontextualize who they are.
So I want to be blunt with you. I think that's really important. I think that's how we grow. So first of all, I will say that if you look at the second page of the document that I left with you, this is a copy of a letter that directly relates to what we're talking about. I sent a letter to the New Yorker in response to Atul Gawande's article. Actually, it was a long article called Hellhole, in which he talked about solitary confinement and how this affected people over time. And I'm going to skip down to the fourth line. I said to them, "No truly educated person believes in discrimination unless abuse of power is more important to that person than maintaining the dignity of another person." We've been talking all morning about the dignity of souls. And that, I think, is imperative to remember. Now I want to get a little bit more blunt, and I want us to understand the principle that I teach my students at John Jay, but I also teach this to folks in prison. And that is that it is important that we as Jews and others, as all people, separate the person from the behavior. So I do not in any regard mean to disrespect former Governor Jerry Brown. However, if we look at the facts, back in 2010 when he ran for re-election for governor of California, he was fighting this whole piece, and he said that he was referring back to what happened when he was Attorney General right before that time. And he represented the state of California in fighting death penalty appeals. And he said that he would put people to death as governor, regardless of his personal beliefs. I would ask us as Jews, I would ask us as people, that if we really are serious about stopping mass incarceration in this country, that we say that the death penalty must stop. We are one of the few countries on the planet that consistently uses it in one form or another. And from my perspective, having dealt with people who are in prison with no chance of parole, that is another kind of death, but they are alive, and I'm sure you understand what I mean. So I could go on and on about this, and the reality is that when I will offer you this, the last part of the question the rabbi was saying was, I'd like to ask all of you to pull back that veil of secrecy. He said, what is a day like in prison? And he wanted to expose that. I will give you that. I will not have you come to a prison or jail because it's too dangerous, quite frankly it is. It's too unpredictable. I did work for 4 years in Rikers. We did a social impact bond. I can tell you more about it later. But the reality is, every day I was in there, I was glad I could walk out of there alive. And to realize that those men and women that were staying in there might not. It was very sad. So I'll offer you this. So if you're ever interested in coming to one of my classes at John Jay and having me converse with people that have been in prison, you can do that. I also work in various communities, various organizations within the community, where I actually work with clients firsthand that have gotten out of prison. And so it's not about me, but you can come and watch me teach them, and you can see how absolutely amazing they are. If we go to the first page of my sheet, and then we'll get on to the next question. I say at number 1 that the leadership of the planet is locked up in jails and prisons, and the rest of those people are out on parole and probation. And we're talking about, as you know from our discussion this morning, 6.5 million people at one time in this country. That's a lot of people, and that's purely intentional, and we can get to that later. That doesn't mean that you and I are not leaders. What I'm saying is the vast majority of the people that I've ever worked with during 28 years of working in prisons and jails are leaders, and they're locked up.
So we are now as a Jewish community, in our season of Teshuvah. The Rabbi Maimonides describes Teshuvah as repentance, atonement, and then return. And so I want to ask, in what ways does life in prison life, does incarceration preclude someone from going through this process of Teshuvah? In what ways also does it support a process of Teshuvah? What have you seen? What's been your experience?
So I think I'll begin by saying that, prison jail in this country is not facilitated or geared towards a concept like tissue. It is geared towards punishment, right? And you can't have repentance and atonement forced on someone. That has to come from within. And when people enter the justice system, there's, we're going to sentence you to this, and we're going to do this to you, and we're going to put you in a cell, and we're going to do this, and it's all these external things acting on a person. None of it is coming from inside. And if you can't get to someone internally, they're not going to change, right? And so I think at this point, I would just like us all to realize that there are very little programs geared towards repentance and atonement, and especially return inside prisons. Over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen dramatic cuts in prison programming, more and more money going towards security. This past Friday was the 25th anniversary of the 1994 crime bill. The 1994 crime bill ended Pell eligibility in prison to people in prison. We knew empirically that if someone got an education in prison, they were the least likeliest to go back. They didn't go back to prison, they came home, they got a job, they supported their family, re-entered society, civically engaged, totally altered people's life outcomes. Yet, we ended that program. Congress ended that program. Joe Biden ended that program. Bill Clinton ended that program. And we went overnight from having about 800 college and prison programs across this country to less than 10. That is dramatic. It eviscerated college in this country. So Bard College, in 1999, a young man walked into Leon Botstein's office and says, I want to take college to prison. And Leon Botstein, being Leon Botstein, said to Max Kerr, like, let's do it. And Leon Botstein, also being Leon Botstein, didn't know how they would pay for it, right? But they found a way, and it started with, at Bard, we started with 15 students in one classroom. And again, now we have 350 students across 6 different, both men and women, across 6 different New York State correctional facilities. We have about 600 alumni of the program who have been released. Our alumni get out and take on jobs and positions back in their communities that have outsized impacts in their communities, whether they're in senior leadership positions at the Bronx Defenders, whether at the Brooklyn Bill Fund, Open Societies Foundation, Ford Foundations, and property management, working on closed Rikers, teaching task, which is the new GED, out in Brooklyn. They're here on the ground, and they're doing it is because education gave them a meaningful way to participate in Teshuvah, right? It gave them a way of understanding their position in the world. I don't want to speak to someone else's kind of repentance and atonement. I think that's a personal thing for them. But I think, you know, my personal experience in BPI is that it brought me to understand how I got to where I was, to accept that, and gave me a path forward. So allowed me to return back into the community. I finished my college degree post-release. I didn't have enough time to finish in prison. That first summer, this was 2018, I worked as a policy advisor on Attorney General campaign. Then I went into some project management stuff in the private sector, and now I'm running government affairs at BPI. So education in prison gave me that ability to participate in that concept. And so there's my Teshuvah.
Thank you for that. You know, I'm a person who also discovered, you know, education in prison, and you can imagine, right, 13 years, you got about 5 or 6 years in, and you look at the calendar, if you can find one, you're like, okay, I still have another 8 more to go. Like, what do I do? And for a long time, I think I asked myself, you know, so I was arrested for robbery in the first degree. You know, I went to a convenience store, I robbed a convenience store to feed my family at the time. 21 years old, I think that I had all the answers to life's complicated questions. And I realized that I applied criminal solutions to everyday problems that people have. And I want to ask myself, why do I feel comfortable, you know, responding with a criminal solution, in this case holding a gun to somebody, when Joe Schmo doesn't have money and they'll go get on public assistance? Like, what made me, what allowed me to give myself the permission to do that? You know, and as I was searching for those questions, I actually didn't find any of the answers inside of none of the programs, specifically, you know, anger behavior management and a lot of the dog and pony show programs that they have. But I found a lot of the answers inside of, like, literally self-help, educational, old textbooks in this case. And the funny thing about education is that the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. You're like, wow, I didn't know this. But not knowing that, that in turn fuels your need to know more, so you go through this cyclical kind of like self-discovering process. So I add the power of education to that, and then I also add that it's easy to talk about atonement and harm and things like that when it's a term that we can easily wrap our minds around. Say, 16-year-old non-violent juvenile offender who got locked up for a bag of weed. It's easy to talk about that through that lens. But how do we talk about, you know, harm that's been done in atonement through the lens of someone, let's say, who killed someone or took someone's life, or sexual offense? You know, that looks a whole lot different. It's a lot more difficult to actually talk about, although we may be talking about the same thing. And one of the things that I found very powerful during my incarceration, besides education, was restorative justice. Right? We talk about folks like myself, you know, who have actually broken the law, but there's this limited conversation to crime victims. In this case, the person who I harmed. And one of the programs that I was involved in actually sat across a woman who had been robbed at gunpoint. You know, and I tell you right now, and they're not paying me to say this, I think that I got more out of that conversation with this woman in about, it was a series of conversations, but that first conversation, more than any engagement with correctional officers, more than any type of solitary, any type of anything, you know? And I wonder why couldn't this conversation happen in the community? And now this work being done around now, shout out Common Justice, Daniel Surratt over there, who's doing a lot of great work around restorative justice practices. Right, but it's not just for, in this case, you know, the person who broke the law and the person who's been harmed, but also let's understand that, you know, when we think about violence, specifically violence, right, that a lot of folks who actually commit harm have been harmed themselves, and looking at harm through a trauma-informed lens and understanding that a lot of times the perpetrator is also a victim. And if we look at the person through that lens, it allows us opportunities to really address the behavioral issue, whatever it may be. You know, right now, corrections responds to violence through solitary, and I can show you tons of data that shows that solitary actually exasperates violence. You know, I was just talking to a commissioner in Nevada, saying, well, we don't have nothing to do with the people in solitary. I'm like, well, you're not really trying to address your gang problem here and the violence. So really talking about that, and then also, you know, there's also incarcerated crime victims, right, who the correctional department responds to with solitary. In other words, if I get cut in prison, I'm going to solitary. They might not call it solitary, and we can have that conversation, but I'm also going to receive some type of punishment when I was just a victim of a crime, but the crime is discounted because it happened in a correctional setting. So that's part of the veil, but also part of how the backward ideology, right? Like the worse that I treat you is going to make you change, not knowing that that behavior in itself exasperates the exact problem. And that is like my most frustrating things about with corrections. So thinking about different ways to address these problems, whether it's through self-help and self-education, but also, you know, kind of holding the mirror up to both parties and actions and looking at folks through a trauma-informed lens, understanding that a lot of times the perpetrator is also a victim, and when we look at it like that, it opens up opportunities for more programs and more health kind of informed approaches.
And I just think, just to be clear, that there are no real programs in New York State prisons. There are none. As Johnny pointed out, you know, the prison solution to everything is to put someone in solitary, or to put them under keep lock, or to penalize them in some way. They have no rehabilitative apparatus, despite what they say. Despite what they say. And then in terms of, you know, put education and work we do at BPI in perspective, there's 46,000 people in New York State prison. Less than 900 of them have access to higher education. Less than 900. Right? And so what we're doing, and it's like we're doing everything we can, is nowhere near enough.
Absolutely, Dyjuan is right. The nature of corrections, not only in New York State, but throughout the country, and not the world, by the way, that's different. But in this state is to do two things. One is the idea is that corrections officers are there for two reasons. One is safety, and one is control. That's it. So imagine if corrections officers in the state of New York or throughout the rest of the country were actually given the proper education to counsel at the same time. That would be really interesting. Right now, it's not even considered. So when I'm teaching corrections courses at John Jay, I'm expected to teach the students what corrections officers are supposed to do. So here's the way I put it with them, because many of my students want to be COs. I tell them, if you do not respect the people that you are working with in a prison, and I do not like the word inmate, so I'm not going to use it, but I'm saying it to you so you know what the context is. If you do not love and respect them as you work with them, do not become a corrections officer. They look at it, we talk about that, and that's very important. Also, I would also encourage you in terms of understanding this concept of healing and confinement, because there isn't enough, is to look at what the BART Prison Initiative is more about. Google it, it's fantastic. I have published work in that area, so I really commend you for what you're doing. Third, I would mention that at John Jay College we have what is called the Prisoner Reentry Institute. You might want to Google that, the Prisoner Reentry Institute. And within that we have a program where we have professors that go up to Otisville, which is a minimum security facility, about 50 miles outside of New York, up north, and we teach courses and have students from John Jay for one semester sit with folks that are in prison, and they're also taking the class with the students, which is amazing. I taught a class on ethics for a day, which was unbelievable. And then I would also add that really the only way to enhance healing in any kind of situation of confinement in a prison or jail is basically for me to be arrogant. I'm smiling at you and say, be arrogant and tell you that we need to abolish jails and prisons in this country and replace them with something that is compassionate, that is healing, that educates, as these gentlemen have pointed out. Until that happens, and until we understand that at the core of all of this is capitalism, that the reason that prisons and jails exist is to make a lot of money off of people and not help people, we will continue to have all these people coming and going from prison. But that's another probably discussion for another time. And I want to make it clear that some people do need to be confined because they are a danger to themselves and others. However, let us do it with respect. And solitary confinement is not respect.
Yeah, just to add on before the next question, is I think the conversation is more about equality than it is about the number of questions that I answer. But I think, you know, there's a thin line between punishment and accountability. You know, I have a 19-year-old daughter, you know, and a 1-year-old son. So like, you know, when my daughter does something, right, that it's irresponsible, and she has done a lot of irresponsible things, probably, you know, she's catching up to me. And, you know, my response to her is still going to come out of a place of love, right? I'm going to like stick her in the bathroom and say, hey, you're going to be there for 23 hours a day. Your last meal's at 5 o'clock. The light's going to stay on. I'm going to knock on the door every hour and hour to make sure you didn't escape out of this windowless room. You know, I probably brought up on charges. I think it's cool. You know, there's probably other lawyers in the room that can educate me on what type of charges are there. But it's ironic how we actually do exactly that, and we give ourselves permission to do that because it's in a correctional setting. You know, how we give ourselves permission to strip juveniles naked, right? 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, take your clothes off. You know, but in society, you don't go to jail. But in prison, it's okay because you're incarcerated. So we give ourselves permission to treat people a certain way just because they're there, independent of the fact whether they're innocent or not. And when I talk to audiences, well, if you can't do the crime, then don't do the time. If you can't do the time, don't do the crime. Great. How do I tell this to somebody like Khalif Browder?
Right.
How do I tell that? And I can rattle off countless names, and I'm sure other folks in this room. How do I tell this to someone like that? So no, just because you're incarcerated, you do not lose your dignity, you do not lose your humanity, right? And prison in itself is the punishment. So rethinking what does accountability look like versus punishment. And in solitary confinement, it's punishment in its rarest form. We talk about programs. While you're incarcerated in solitary, you can't take advantage of the bar prison program. You can't take advantage of a number of different programs, which then parole says, oh, you didn't take your programs. Sorry, it's 2 more years. So understanding how people get caught up in this web, that beyond no matter what you do, right? Very recently in New York, there's been, and the fight still continues to make sure that the the parole board doesn't give you 2 more years just because of the nature of your crime. Like I did 20 years, I can't go back 20 years. Look at what I've done since I've been incarcerated. I've taken college, I've educated your correctional officers, I've done a number of different things. And we still have a board of parole that holds people there indefinitely a lot of times just because of the nature of the crime and because of things that folks can't change. So rethinking accountability versus punishment and understanding that yes, people do need to be separated a lot of times. Trust me, I've sat across many people and I'm like, you don't play well in the sandbox. Like, yeah, I'm keeping it, it's completely real. 9 different prisons throughout my journey and I've definitely met these folks. But even then, I've seen opportunities to be able to engage these folks in a meaningful, truly meaningful way. And I didn't mean to hijack the panel, just
I think that's important, you know, to give appropriate context and understanding. And I just want to touch on 2 things. You know, Kimora pointed out that the officers are there for safety and control. That is a niche, a box that they have pigeonholed themselves into. That is something that their union contract has negotiated, and what that means in plain language is that we get to come to work and do the absolute minimum. What that means is that I'm here to unlock a cell, to lock the cell back. That is my job. I am not here to counsel people. I am not here to help rehabilitate people. I am not here to treat people with respect and dignity. So that kind of thinking is something that they have lobbied for, and the corrections union has lobbied for in the interest of laziness. to be blunt,
Absolutely.
in the interest of laziness.
Absolutely.
So there's that. And then the second thing is that the reality is that the vast majority of people in this country are going to get out of prison at the rate of over 600,000 people every year. We need to be thinking about conditions under which we want them to be re-entering society. There are very few people in this country who need to be in prison. And when we are imprisoning people, it's usually as a solution to some type of social injustice or inequity that if we had the courage, we would fix in some other way. So I just want to be clear to that. I don't think that, mass incarceration, jail, is ever the solution to anyone's problems.
Actually, I want to ask you a little bit more about that, the conditions of confinement. I think what we're hearing is that confinement also doesn't end once you leave jail or prison, and that there are so many barriers to return, and the goal of Teshuvah is return. And there's so many barriers to return, and also it's not, again, just to highlight that the people who are incarcerated have complex stories and are often and mostly victims themselves of abuse, of systemic injustice and racism, and there's so many complex paths which people end up incarcerated. And so recognizing that, and then also recognizing the ways in which families of people who are incarcerated are themselves also confined in many ways. And so if you guys could talk about that a little bit, the ways that confinement extends outside of jail or prison and also to families.
In New York State, you leave prison after 5, after 2, after 20 years, and they give you $40. That's what they give you. That's it. Then you get out of prison. You're usually on parole. I got out of prison, and I was fortunate enough to have a degree and have services, reentry services from the Bar Prison Initiative that allowed me to get out and continue my education. And we worked on like a reentry plan and to execute. But the reality is, for that, the vast majority of people coming out of prison, they don't have any support. It's that $40 from the state. And besides not having support, they have a bunch of options that they are cut off from because they have felonies or they're on parole. There's about 35,000 laws and barriers and things on the books in this country barring people with convictions from educational spaces, from different types of occupations. That's kind of insane, but those are there. These are people out of prison. And then, I went to parole. Parole didn't help me find a job. They didn't help me continue my education. The entire opposite. I would go there every 2 weeks and sit there for 5 hours to be seen for 5 minutes. It's a total waste of my time. It has done nothing for me to help me reacclimate into society, but it will do everything at the first chance it gets to send me back to prison, right? Look at Rikers Island. 20% of the population of Rikers are there on technical violations of parole. Things like violating curfew, smoking marijuana. It is the only growing population, it's grown by 30% over the past 5 years on Rikers. So when we talk about barriers when people come back out, they are numerous and have been erected in so many ways and are designed primarily to send people back to prison. 2/3 of the people committed to prison in New York State every year are on violations of parole. That's 66% of the people committed to New York State prison every year are on violations of parole. It is the biggest and most single driver of mass incarceration in this state.
One of those people was my own brother. I graduated from St. Francis College in Brooklyn, and of course, just like any family member, you try to uplift your own brother in this case. And we had him set to go to St. Francis College, full scholarship, but he's still on parole, and sometimes we come home with a negative disposition towards authority figures, like a police officer says, hey, come here, give me your ID. No, I'm not giving you my ID. Why? Even if I don't know the law, no, I'm not giving you my ID. Except that when you're on parole, you can't say no. In fact, just being on parole later on, that turns into police contact. And my brother got violated for police contact because he refused to give his ID to a police officer. So here it is, 2 months later, sitting on Rikers Island, you know, one of the statistics, you know, that we just heard about. He's like one of these many folks who are sitting there. But folks need to understand that in 2 months, so much can change and happen. So he lost his girlfriend, of course, he lost his scholarship to go to the St. Francis, where I graduated from, and then more importantly, lost his job. And then it's like, well, by the way, we'll let you go now, we won't send you upstate, we'll just reinstate you, meaning that they'll basically just kind of like start your parole time all over again, and the 2 months you spent there don't count towards that. And we have a whole nother panel about how they play with that time. You know, but I think what most important was that when he came out, he was more defeated than the first time. And this is, and I'll tell you, this is my example, and this is very personal to me, because he's been released a few times where I'm like, hey, I got you, man, like, whatever we need to do, and he just can't, like, get a step ahead. And here it is, when he actually tried to give it a shot, he's like, I'm back here now. Like, what do I do now? And now he's slowly picking up the pieces, and I invite him to my speaking engagements and just sit in the audience and things like that. But I think about how many other folks, the thousands if not millions of folks, feel so defeated, they come home, they've done a million and one things, and now here it is, I'm back again. I've written about this, and I'm sorry I'm so disorganized, I didn't bring cards or anything like that, but if you Google Johnny Perez / criminal justice, you'll see some op-eds that I've written and things like that. So just want to like really emphasize the technical violation piece and how everyone who lands in prison didn't break the law, right? If I got an ankle monitor and it says, hey, I can't cross the street, and that thing goes off, I'm in violation, and I'm already, because of my record, I don't get the benefit of the doubt. I don't get to explain my side of the story. I really don't, even in the court of law. So truly understanding that. When we think about reentry, and it's easy, right? Housing, employment, those are really obvious ones. But we don't talk about, like, how do you learn to live with a family that has learned to live without you for so many years? Right? And this is also very personal to me, right? I was locked up 2 days after my daughter was born, 2 days. Released 13 years later, she's 13 years old, right? I saw her 5 times during the time I was incarcerated, not by her choice, but because prisons like Attica and prisons like Clinton are so far away that it's almost impossible for my daughter's mother to get there. And she's now a single mother, and now I also became a bill because it costs money to talk to your family, it costs money to send them food, commissary costs money, all that stuff costs money, right? So really truly understanding the barriers that we place on people, but more importantly, understanding the lack of transitional services that I like to burden the department with. You know, in my last role, I worked with the Urban Justice Center in Rectory as a civil legal services firm. I was surprised they hired me. It was my first job out of prison, but I worked with people who were suffering or living with mental health challenges and also facing reentry issues. And I interviewed 113 different individuals, and we found that people actually were released misdiagnosed, underdiagnosed, right, without medications. I had one client who got an address to a building that didn't even exist anymore, right? And because it's not on his medication, it's like, maybe the building is here or it's not, or maybe, you know, what's going on here? And fortunately enough, he found us, but I think about the other folks who have not, you know, who are in his position and not been able to access services. And lastly, I'll say, people are released directly from solitary. Reentry does not start the day that you are released. It should start the minute you're handcuffed. You know, and a good friend of mine was in the audience, Wesley Keynes, also always says that. Of course, reentry begins the minute that you're arrested. Don't wait until I did 20 years. 3 months earlier, you're like, well, where are you going to live? You know, or where are you going to work at? I mean, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, you'll fail every single time, and that's the best way for me to describe reentry.
You know, if we imagine what it would be like if you or I had been locked up in Sing Sing for 20 or 30 years, and then the person finally gets to get out. And it's very interesting because, and I'm trying to not be flippant here, but you could actually use this on a game show. Sing Sing is the only prison in this country that has a Metro North or anything similar, just running right through the middle of it, right? So people can actually just leave and get on Metro North, and they can go right straight down after they're released from prison and go down to Grand Central. So I always tell the guys when I work with them in Sing Sing that, you know, you have to understand that a lot of things have changed, and these are barriers in and of themselves. I remember once, a few years ago, one guy was so happy to be getting out, and I was really happy for him, and he got his possessions that had been sitting there, came over and he showed me the token. And I said, but you can't use that anymore. And he didn't understand because he'd been locked up that long. Then I had to tell him that when you get to the subway area in particular, that there may be police there. And they may ask you to look at your possessions. Tell them, okay, yeah, I'll open it up, that's okay. They're not after you personally. Times have changed, but they don't understand this. And third, I would say to them, there is such a thing as sexual harassment law. They don't know what I'm talking about if they've been in there for 20 or 30, 40 years. They don't know what I mean. So I have to explain that to them. These are incredible barriers that sometimes the public doesn't seem to understand. If we look at these two fine gentlemen here, and I'm not saying anybody in here is saying this, but many people in the public would judge and say, well, they should have known better. What do you mean he had her daughter was born, you know, he should have thought of that before he did it, right? That's not the way you and I are. Nobody on this planet is perfect. And if somebody's starving to death, some people will do things that you and I don't think are great, and they're going to realize it later. But if people aren't taught, they won't know. The biggest barrier, I believe, is lack of education and all those things that I mentioned before. I'm all for closing Rikers for many reasons, but if in this city we open up more areas where people will be confined, and those corrections officers that have been working at Rikers, who are not nice to people. There are plenty that are nice, don't get me wrong. I worked there for 4 years straight, and I've met some wonderful people there. But if you have a corrections officer that is not treating people with dignity, that person without proper education will continue the same pattern of abuse of people later.
I just, very important, just to kind of point out, I think this is true of police forces and CO forces, or however you want to categorize them, is that, you always hear these things like, oh, this cop murdered this person, or they assaulted this person, and that's like the bad apple in the bunch. I think there's a grain of truth there, in that there are, a certain population of officers in whatever departments that are really, really bad, right? We understand that they're the people we see on the news, but what we have to look at is that the institutional culture supports and enables those people. So it is an abusive, punitive institution that enables them to mistreat people. So like this idea that, the NYPD is saying, well, that's not us, that's just this officer. Or DOC is saying, that's not us, that's just this officer, and yet that officer keeps their job, right? And so we have to always be holding the institutions accountable, the entire body's accountable.
So we actually have to close now.
Could you just give us some priority action items that we can take with us? Because I think a lot of us are involved in advocacy and lobbying. We talk about a lot of stuff, but how about 3 or 4 real key action items to start with?
So I'm going to move really, really fast. We have bipartisan legislation at the national level to reinstate Pell Grants to prisoners. Call your congressman, call your senator, tell them to pass the REAL Act. It's called the REAL Act. You do the same thing at the state level in relation to TAP. And lastly,
Relation to what?
TAP, which is tuition assistance. That's at the state level. Pell is at the federal level.
TAP.
And TAP, yes. And lastly, go to bpi.bar.edu. Check out the work that we're doing. Find ways to support us.
Great.
Thank you.
NYCAIC.org. It's the state campaign here that's looking to end solitary. We actually have a bill, an active bill in the country, probably the most progressive bill across the country right now to end solitary. The advocates here got it all the way up to the governors, up to the leadership, and I'll tell you right now, the last minute, the leadership of both Assembly and Senate went and like some backdoor literally deal with the governor, and they didn't present the bill. It's straight politics. Call the governor and tell them that we definitely need to pass HALT. And then lastly, it's called the HALT Solitary Act, Confinement Act, and I'll hang around and get my information. And lastly, fund the work. Very simple. The conditions work specifically is looked over a lot of times, and because I think that people miss how it's connected to parole and how it's connected to a lot of other parts of the system that we're now looking at and we find more palatable, so to speak. You know, but the work doesn't get done unless it's funded, plain and simple. And work needs to be led by folks who are directly impacted by the issue. If you're looking to an organization and support that organization, if you do not have folks in the leadership who are directly impacted, you know, and not just anybody who just came home, like folks who have the capacity to lead in that role, who also been directly impacted, they need to be. And then you can also push them in that respect, which is one of my challenges.
I would recommend that you email me on the sheet here, the documents that I use, because I'm running the Correctional Education Academy, and that's one of the best ways that we can get some action moving to get more people to be doing the kind of work that I do. It's not about me, but the more we empower people, the more we educate people, the better off it's going to be for everybody. Thank you.
There is a religious action center paper on ending solitary confinement. You can find it on the RAC website.
Yes.
If you want the argument.
I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you for being on the panel. Anybody would like to take a giant prize?